So we have created our VPC and we have some subnets in here, 6 to be exact, because there's 2 per availability zone. One is public per availability zone. One is private per availability zone. What I want to do is actually create some instances here, and we'll see what it looks like to make instances in a public versus a private availability zone. So over here in EC2, I'm in Ohio still. We have one instance running, and I'm going to create a new one, 2 new ones actually, although there will be a different one each, different setting each. We'll go down to Ubuntu 2004, 64-bit, x86, not ARM. We'll select it, and we'll see the horrendous number of options available when creating a new instance. Now, skip T2s. T2s are old, so I'm going to go right to T3 in my case. I'll do something small here, t3.small, which is not the smallest. It's enough for our purposes here, more than enough. So review and launch, you can go directly to that, but we're configuring instance details for us instead. I do want 2 instances, but I'm going to do one at a time here because I want slightly different settings per instance. Network here, we have a default VPC and this VPC we just created. This is the one we're going to want, this VPC. And then we have our choice of a bunch of subnets. So headed over here, this subnet that's selected has a tag that shows that it is meant for public traffic. So I want this subnet that is OC164E. So let's find that one, OC164E. I know it's going to be a public subnet in the US2A region. Auto assign public IP addresses, use the subnet setting, which is going to be to enable it. So this is going to auto assign a public IP address to the server. So that'll make it accessible to the outside internet. Now, if I did disable, the server would get created. It would be in a public subnet, but it would not get assigned an IP address, which means it would not be able to reach the outside internet, and the outside internet cannot reach it. So even though it's in an internet gateway, if you don't give it a public IP address, then it doesn't get assigned a network interface that connects to that internet gateway, and therefore it is basically inaccessible. Now, you can still access it through the private network, but that requires a different server to be in the private network that is publicly accessible. In other words, it would be like a Bastion host or a jump host that you might use then to talk to the server. So it's pretty rare to have a server in a public subnet that does not have a public IP address. All this stuff, we can ignore the rest of this. We're not going to do anything like add in IAM roles, and we don't need any other stuff here. Almost all of this is usually ignorable. Not always, but often. We can add storage. I'll just let it do the default of 8 gigabytes, although the default of GP3 should be the one that you prefer instead of the older GP2 general purpose instance. 8 gigabytes is totally fine. I'll add some tags here. Public test instance will be the name that we give it. Configure security groups. I'm going to do one that I created called test security group delete me later, and it just gives public SSH access. Review and launch. Launch it. Acknowledge that I have these SSH keys hanging around somewhere. And I do indeed have the Cloudcast Forge IP, SSH key around, so I'll launch the instance using that SSH key. Now, there's some stuff I'm skipping here, like that security group I created. I didn't show you that. That key that I just added to the server so I can SSH in, I did not show you creating that. That's just something that was already there. So that'll be some other videos and other courses. So instance is now launching. Let's go ahead and create another instance. This one will be another Ubuntu instance. I'll do another T3 small. This one's going to be in that VPC again. Now the subnet here, before we did OC164E, which was a public network, and I have one public and one private network per availability zone. So we know that this other one in US2A is going to be private. Notice that the public IP address setting immediately became disabled by default because it's a private subnet. And we'll add storage, GP3, add tags, name will be testing private server. I forget what I named the first one, but something close to that. Security groups. This is actually going to have the same security group to allow SSH traffic. Review and launch. Launch it. Cloudcast Forge key is the one I had. And we'll create that instance. Now let's go over here. And we can see these 2 instances are kind of somewhat running. One is running, the first one, that is named public test instance. Let's manage tags and give this name a capital N. And then we'll save that. And this one, the same treatment. Manage tags, capital N, save. And then that will finally show up here. The name has to be capitalized there, right? Okay, so these are both initializing. Let's just give it a second and see when we can connect to one. Okay, so our public test instance has a public IP address. So let's go ahead and copy that. And then we'll head over here and we can SSH-I, that was, let's see, cloudcastforge.pem. Ubuntu is the user for Ubuntu servers, and there's the IP address. Yes. And I can connect them into it. And we can see I have this private IP address that was given to the server. And there's really nothing else to see. I'm in the server, nothing's installed, it's just there. Now, this one should be up and running if we refresh this page. So how do we SSH into it? Well, we can do it through the private network, the private IP address it has. So if I go ahead and click on this, again, there's no public IP address, right? So I can't access this instance publicly at all. I don't have a way to access it unless I'm already in the private network, which is the case because I'm actually into the server and the server is in that same private network. And so I can actually connect to this server using this server as a jump host, as a Bastion host. I'm in the private network through the server, so I can SSH into other servers in the private network now. So testing private server, it has a network here, which has a private IP address of .25.181. So let's go ahead and see SSH. Now we have an issue. I don't have an SSH key to give it here. So I can't actually SSH into it unless I have the private key added here. There is a trick to do some agent forwarding in SSH. I just don't remember off the top of my head. So let's go ahead and do this. Cat cloudcast forward.pem, put that into my clipboard here, and I will create that file here. I'm just going to call it cloudcast.pem. I'll set paste. I'm going to paste this in here, but I'm going to hide it in the video so you do not see it because you should not see my private keys, of course. Okay, that's done. And now let's what was that IP address? This private IP address was 25181, so I'll copy that. SSH-I call that cloudcast.pem, and the user will be Ubuntu at the private network IP address here. And then we should be able to connect to it once I do one thing. I have to set the permissions correctly to that file. Otherwise, SSH says the permissions are too open for it. Fix that before I let you use that. Okay, I'm in. Now I'm into that private server, the server that's in the private subnet at the 25181 instance at that IP address. Okay, so I can curl google.com. I should be able to because this is in a NAT gateway, and the NAT gateway allows the network calls from this private subnet server, from the server in the private subnet, to reach the outside internet without the outside internet reaching the server. So I don't have a way to reach the server from the public internet. I have to use this Bastion host, this jump host, but this server can make network calls to the outside internet. So it can do things like apt-get update, apt-get install, all that good stuff. Now, if I exit this, now I'm in the public server, the server in the public network. And of course that can curl google.com because it is on a public network. It can be reached from the public internet, and it can reach the public internet through the internet gateway. And the fact that it has a public network IP address, a public IP address assigned to the server. Okay, so that's it. This is what it looks like to have a server that's in a public network. It can be reached through the public internet, and I can use that as a jump host to get into the server that's in the private network and the private subnet, and it cannot be reached from the outside internet, but it can reach the outside internet itself. It can curl google.com and do apt-get update and apt-get install and all that good stuff. So that's a bit of what that looks like when you have servers in the private versus public subnet.